When good media takes a bounded form, and comes once in a period of time, it begs to be consumed as a whole. It creates an engaging experience. We don't dip in and out of an episode of Game of Thrones, after all, we take it in as a whole. Why have we abandoned this concept when it comes to publications, simply because they exist online? Gleeful, unembarrassed ruthlessness, once rightly kept in check, has become normal among us, and Game of Thrones is a success because this change is now more or less complete. These are moments in your life to be cherished, they don't come around that often. To be flying around in a Game of Thrones jet, to be greeted by massive enthusiasts. The only thing that being killed off on Graceland helped me with on Game of Thrones is that it made me available to actually do the job. My life is unrecognizable compared to what it was. Game of Thrones has opened doors that were never there before. But it can be dangerous to see it in those terms, I think. It's best to take it as it comes and work as hard as you can, and hopefully the other things fall into place. I do watch Revenge, American Horror Story, and Game of Thrones. I am behind on all of them, but I do watch them. Those are my go-to shows. I think the beauty of the writing of Game of Thrones is not that the characters are fearless, it's how they overcome their fear, you know? I grew up reading a lot of fantasy/sci-fi. It was really all I read, anything from Dragonlance, when I was 12, to The Wheel of Time and Robert Jordan stuff, to George R.R. Martin, who did Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a good one to binge-watch, except you realize at the end of every episode that you've been holding your breath for, like, 30 minutes, which is probably not good for your brain. I think that it's interesting how shows like Walking Dead, or even Game of Thrones, with all its fantasy elements, have become so popular. Sometimes, though, I get a little bit annoyed because the whole nerd thing taking over and is now cool, and it wasn't cool when I was younger. I think Game of Thrones was extraordinary. I want to do some period pieces. It would be lovely to tell great stories, that is my main ambition, and to be working with amazing creators. For kids growing up now, there's no difference watching Avatar on an iPad or watching YouTube on TV or watching Game of Thrones on their computer. It's all content. It's just story. Why is Game of Thrones the most pirated show in the history of TV? Because people can't get it fast enough, that's why. Typically in Game of Thrones, people who are honest and just and do things for the right reasons tend not to survive. I watch Sons of Anarchy and Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, and think, I want to create that kind of television. The fantasy world, the Game of Thrones world, the Forgotten Realms worlds, they're the type of worlds I've always wanted to live in, where vampires, dragons, dwarves and elves are real. I spent a whole summer working on what proved to be a Game of Thrones. One of the most beautiful things about Game of Thrones is it's told from so many different points of view, and these characters can convince you that what they're doing is right. But they're only showing you a bit of the picture, and when you see it from another character's point of view you may switch allegiances. The challenge is, in terms of a canon like X-Men, it's more like Harry Potter and Hogwarts, or Game of Thrones. It needs time and space to evolve and to bring the reader or viewer in and give them a result that's worth the investment of that time. I like Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones. I like that era. I like that fantasy world. After my last audition for Game of Thrones, they said, "Congratulations, princess." I was like, bye-bye, call center. One thing Game of Thrones has taught us all is to guard against too much emotional investment. I guess my silly dream is to be on Game of Thrones. I don't think that I can do that, but that's my silly dream. And there are a lot of American comedies, particularly on NBC, that I would love to do. Nina Gold is a fantastic casting director. She's doing the new Star Wars movies, but she also does Game of Thrones and many of the working title movies, and she did Rush. My kids are always like, "Why do people always want to take pictures with you?" And I'm like, "Because I'm your dada, and you're my daughter." That's why. It's definitely mostly because of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is a fantasy show not dedicated to any specific time, but it seems to exist in sort of a 1400s medieval fantasy world, and in that setting, I wouldn't have had a six-pack. We see a lot of gory deaths on Game of Thrones. I thought, Game of Thrones had this challenge in filming, and it's one of those things you think, it can't get worse than this, because it's really cold, and you're in pain, and it's miserable. There doesn't seem to be a religion in Game of Thrones that's totally peaceful. We haven't seen any Buddhists. Game of Thrones, people say that it's a fantasy series, but it's a hell of a lot more than that. It attracts the so-called geeks and nerds, and God bless them, they're wonderful for getting right into the show. But primarily it's about family, it's power and betrayal and jealousy. It's all those wonderful things that a fantastic drama is about. When I was first told about Game of Thrones, I didn't know the books, anything. So I read the pilot, and when I got the first script, it was clear the story was about these people and families and a constant battle for power. Everyone likes fantasy to get away from everyday life, but I think Game of Thrones is not like fairies and unicorns. It's very relatable to everyday life. It's not too fantastic, just a little bit. I think Game of Thrones has been genius, and I really don't want it to end. Every episode is huge. It's totally immense, and the actors are all fantastic in it. It has totally drawn me in. What's so cool about Light of the Seven, and what I love about Game of Thrones, is you never know what's going to happen. Game of Thrones cares about children. Children are heirs. There's no hemming and hawing about how they're desensitized to violence or they cost too much to send to college. They're a blessing, in many ways the only blessing, and even the evil ones have parents who love them. I'm hooked on Game of Thrones. I'm a fan of the books and the show. I think that, like the show Game of Thrones, our fascination with power struggles is pretty unanimous. Game of Thrones is an amazing show, and I have no problem speaking of the virtues of HBO. Google is the enemy. I would tell that to anyone who enjoys any TV show like Game of Thrones to avoid it. It spoils so many storylines. I've been watching Game of Thrones, and I can't wait for Bored to Death to come back. It's one of my faves. You can learn something from everyone in Game of Thrones, whether it is something you learn not to do or something you learn to do. Nothing is impossible on Game of Thrones. Zack Snyder is a huge fan of Game of Thrones, and I met him in the training stunt facility that I train at, and I guess he really liked me because he later called me into his office, and we talked about playing Aquaman. Whether you're a history buff or a fantasy fan, Drogon's epic will keep you turning pages. This was the original Game of Thrones. If you like A Song of Ice and Fire, you will love The Accursed Kings. Game of Thrones has kind of got the Midas touch, certainly for the lead actors and those recurring guest stars. It's the show that can do no wrong because it's so well produced. My contribution is short, but I think, in my mind, it was sweet because it involved such elaborate scenes. I love Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is one of the most groundbreaking series on TV. The fact that I get to make music every day is such a privilege, and I'm incredibly grateful to be doing so with an amazing show such as this. I'm into The Walking Dead, Shaun of the Dead, obviously, and I've seen all the Romero movies. I am a classic zombie queen, and I love the White Walkers on Game of Thrones. Weirdly, it wasn't until pretty late in life that I found my entry point into horror films. Game of Thrones is great, love it. I certainly relate to Ygritte in the fact that she is so strong and also ruthless as well, and I feel that especially within Game of Thrones, I think that as a show, it is one of the front runners for showing dominant female characters and making sure that men answer to women rather than the other way around. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.